We've been leafleting today, so we have been showing that we are an active party, even though there wasn't a great turnout. But Liam and I will carry on the good work and try and get other people interested to make sure that each and every one of those leaflets is delivered, and then we hope to move on to at least a major campaign leaflet and possibly, as Andrew suggested, an intermediate leaflet. We've been discussing informally that the main aim is to fill the niche largely vacated by UKIP, if only because they're not getting the publicity they used to. In the past, Liam and I would work extremely hard for negligible results because UKIP, doing no work at all, would get the ex-Labour nationalist vote. There is clearly a strong nationalist subcurrent in Bradford South because when the BNP was around in the early 2000s, we were getting a third of the electorate. When I stood in Royds from nowhere in 2007, we got a third of the vote straight off, and that couldn't have been a personal vote, it must have been a party vote. So at least a third of the electorate in Royds, which was an even tougher hill to climb, even more Labour ward, were willing to vote BNP in those days. So where have those voters gone? The obvious place is UKIP, that because of the publicity given by the mainstream media, UKIP scooped up voters who had left Labour but were never in a million years going to vote Tory because they see it as the gaffer's party. So there is a niche gap in the market there for what would have been right-wing Labour 20 or 30 years ago, national Labour, in other words, strong on issues like defence, immigration, Britain's place in the world, sovereignty, etc., and therefore pushing Brexit through, but by no means in favour of unfettered capitalist free trade, still less global capitalism. So there is a place in the spectrum of political possibilities for us to move into, and if UKIP is wilting and not getting the publicity it relied on in the past, there is a chance that if we do a great deal of activity and attract people's attention by that activity, that we might get a significant number of votes. They will obviously be, in the main, protest votes. But I would say the people of Bradford South have a lot to protest about. The traffic, as you probably experienced today, is in a state of advanced chaos. It needs money spending on it on things like roundabouts and traffic lights and just systematising it. And the lack of public buildings is going to be acute when the existing swimming pool complex, which is used for the voting, for the counting the votes in the whole of Bradford, that is now in Bradford South. When they knock that building down, I don't think there'll be a public building of any consequence at all. They're thinking of building a new swimming pool, attaching it to a sports facility, but we know that these things tend to go off into the future. Anyway, I don't want to talk just about Bradford because obviously we're a national party, but I assume that certain issues are common to Bradford and to our other main centre of gravity, Leicester, and those would be presumably, perhaps the audience can comment, decentralisation of power. I mean, we're pushing for a town council to try and get powers off the Metropolitan Borough Council delegated to something closer to the people. Now, there's a specific reason for that in my area, in that a lot of Labour councillors commute to work from the leafy suburbs of Shipley and Bingley. They do not live locally. If we set up a town council, they would be excluded from office because they live more than 3 miles from the centre of the town council. I don't know if the same rules apply in your area. I believe they're national rules. But I suggest that if there is a possibility of something like a town council, it's one way of undermining the existing parties, because it would present them, you know what I mean, with a new challenge. And if we had issues that were at the level which a town council could do something about, I don't know whether North West Leicestershire, Loughborough has issues which can be taken away from the county council, or well, perhaps a member of the audience can comment on what the structure in Leicestershire is and how it differs from Bradford. We have a Metropolitan Borough Council which was essentially stitched together by Edward Heath to give the Tories a majority in Bradford, because it was always a Labour city. So they simply attached to it great areas of Tory voting villages and towns, up to Keighley and Ilkley and so on, in order to produce a Tory majority in the Metropolitan Borough as a whole. Is Leicester in any way comparable?
It has a county council and then borough council.
And then borough.
Borough council.
Would they have more or less powers than, for instance, the unitary council in Bradford?
Not certain about that.
Right. I mean, the point is, the national issue that we could address would be bringing democracy back to the people. That right across the Western world, there is clearly a sense of the government is too detached, remote. Where did the Trump voters come from? They came from people who think that the government doesn't look after folks like us. So it's your West Virginia hillbillies basically feeling that Washington is not interested in them, has written them off. Their industries have declined, their neighbourhoods have declined, they feel that they are the forgotten people. Now, there are great swathes of England that are comparable, surely, especially in the North and Midlands, with industries like the mills in Bradford. And what was Leicester's base? I mean, was it again the woolen industry, engineering, or what?
Shoe industry, yes. Hosiery, engineering.
I mean, with one of the things of Nottingham and lace, Northampton and shoes, Leicester was sort of all those sorts of things.
Yeah, yeah.
And they've now, presumably they've suffered massively from foreign competition.
I guess so.
Because all these things sound to me like things you normally now buy cheap imports from Italy or China or somewhere.
Knitwear can be made cheaper abroad than here.
Well, cheap labour.
Yeah.
But is there a revival of specialist industries? High quality, low volume is one way. I mean, it won't ever employ the same scale of workforce. That's the thing. I mean, these things would be high tech. It's just that, I mean, as chairman, one of the things we could look at is issues which both Bradford and Leicester share. These are the two areas that we're going to be standing candidates in. We need to have national issues behind our councillor candidates. Is there enough common ground? One of them would be obviously that they're both suffering from declining industries, a lot of unskilled labour brought in from the Asian subcontinent to fill jobs which no longer exist, but we still have the unskilled and in many cases unskillable workers who can only become taxi drivers or work in fast food restaurants or something, for which obviously there isn't the sheer scale of demand that's ever going to soak up the unemployment. I believe it's true that Pakistani and Bangladeshi unemployment is some of the highest in Britain, and that's usually a function of the low skill level, inability to speak English, lack of technical abilities, as it were, to do any more skilled job. And that isn't going to change in the foreseeable future, as far as I know. Anyway, that would be one issue which I imagine would span both Bradford and Leicester. And academic standards. I see that we've drawn attention to academic standards. What is the situation in Leicester? In Bradford, it's catastrophic. I mean, we bump along on the bottom, and it doesn't take a genius to figure out that's because of the low level of English in the schools, where more than half the population are Asian and speak Urdu among themselves regularly. It's hardly surprising that there's a low level of achievement in academic subjects which ultimately have to be communicated through the medium of English. Though The lowest university application level in the whole of the UK, as far as I know, is Tongue Ward, which Liam has stood for in the past, and that's white working class. But there you have sociological problems because you have an awful lot of one-parent families, and young people simply brought up with minimal expectations. You know, if they get a sort of bottom-level job as somewhere in the building trade or as a motor mechanic or whatever, they feel that's about as good as they can possibly get because that's what the father's generation would have been satisfied with. So again, I mean, we have got it in the leaflet, but it's something we can draw attention to, is the appalling level of academic achievement in Britain as a whole. I mean, we used to be one of the best educated countries in the world. And if you look at the statistics now, we are regularly beaten by places like Estonia or Hungary or Slovakia or whatever. That's not because they've necessarily come on much better, it's because we've become much worse. That's partly because of the nature of the teaching, that we have teacher training colleges turning people out who are left-wing ideologues but not actually very good pedagogues.
Yes, this is the Treasurer's report for 2017. Kevin Stafford is who I am. The newly appointed Treasurer. The National Executive Committee, the NEC, which met on the 27th of August this year, made some changes to party officers. Andrew Bronze, who was the party leader, stepped down, I think to allow fresh impetus into the leadership. I'm not sure exactly what his reasons were. And he was duly appointed as the deputy party leader and as the nominating officer as well. In Andrew's place, Dr. James Luthwaite, who's just spoken, took over Andrew's position as party leader, and former nominating officer Paul Newman had stepped down due to ill health. Adrian Davis also stepped down as the treasurer due to pressures of his employment as a barrister, but he agreed to be appointed as deputy treasurer and to be on hand to offer advice. And I was appointed as the treasurer in his place. Other things that were done were a change of mandate forms were submitted to the party bank in order to change the officers who were permitted to sign party cheques. Paul Newman had stepped down from that position as well as a signature to the party bank account. And he was replaced by Chris Canham and by myself. Adrian Davis, who was the original signatory, remains as a signatory to the bank account. And there is a proposal to appoint a fourth signatory as well in due course. So there's a supply of people who can be on hand to sign party cheques to pay for expenses, etc. The annual re-registration of the party with the Electoral Commission was completed. It was one of the responsibilities of the Treasurer, which I did, and submitted the forms to the Commission by the deadline, which was at the end of October this year, and paid the required £25 fee. The outgoing Treasurer kindly produced a report of his own about his time as Treasurer, and I'll read out what he has written. This is Adrian Davis, who is a former Treasurer. The party's 2016 accounts were duly filed with the Electoral Commission as required by law and well ahead of the deadline. They appear on the Commission's website, as do the previous year's statements, and were, moreover, circulated to members in one of the members' bulletins. All the expenditure in 2017 to date has been completely routine, consisting of some fixed operating expenses, notably the fee for our post office box, the running costs of the website, and the annual fee payable to the Electoral Commission, plus printing costs for literature in respect of election campaigns, particularly the one in Loughborough at the County Council elections in May, which form the principal head of expenditure, and it's only right to be proper for a political party whose purpose is to fight elections, not to hoard money. The party gives thanks to Frank Carlin, should be recorded, not only for his sterling work as membership secretary, including keeping a spreadsheet of subscriptions and donations, which make the treasurer's task much easier, but also for finding a more economical internet service provider, so reducing our overall costs. So well done to Frank. The party's current financial position is healthy. Its cash balance at the date of the most recent bank statement was £2,999, though the adjusted balance, taking into account outstanding refunds due to members who have paid for warm-up leaflets for next May's local elections, the annual fee due to the Electoral Commission, and the hire of the room for the AGM, and anticipated expenditure for new party badges, all come to £600 lower, standing at, so the net figure stands at £2,400. In previous years, the party has been able to subsidise the expense of contesting elections out of central funds, which Adrian believes is the first for any similar party. It will easily be able to do so again in 2018 at the present rate, if the party's electoral activity is confined to local government elections as is presently anticipated. In July 2017, he handed over the treasurership to me, Kevin Stafford, as he had been a registered officer of the BDP for longer than anyone else. Adrian is a very busy, self-employed barrister, and so he will take a break from the responsibility for the time being to the somewhat bureaucratic Electoral Commission. He has made complaints about them before. I will, however, gladly help Kevin as Deputy Treasurer for so long as he finds his assistance helpful, especially with the preparation of the full 2017 accounts due in January. And that is Adrian's report for his time as Treasurer. And that concludes the party Treasurer's report. Thank you very much. Thank you.
When we adopted the BNP in 2013, I was going to say when we founded it, but of course we didn't. It was founded separately by Adrian and another 3 or 4 years before. But we adopted it en masse in 2013. And we were hoping that it would become a mass membership party, something that would replace and stand in the position of the BNP at its height. In that hope, we obviously failed. We're a tiny fragment among many fragments. Now, it might be tempting for us to say, well, in that case, leave the role to one of the other parties, or perhaps even non-party organisations. But in my view, that choice would be problematic. That decision would be problematic. Why? Because Britain needs an electable nationalist party. But none of those organisations, in my view, fits the bill. Some are, of course, not registered as parties and have no wish to be registered as parties. Indeed, some of them say there's no electoral route. Now, I don't underestimate the difficulties that face nationalist parties on an electoral route, but frankly, there is no other route. And I have asked people this: if there's no electoral route, how do we get there? And I'm really met by a rather embarrassing silence. Now, what about the parties that are registered? Well, some, and I'm talking principally about the rump BNP here, are run by untrustworthy people, some of whom are simply not genuine nationalists. So the idea of leaving the way for them unchallenged is not an option. Looking across the board of people representing nationalist parties, many of them have many qualities, but they are accustomed to say provocative things that, if we were significant enough, would repel people we need as potential voters. And in my view, we need to present the right kind of moderate image without presenting the wrong kind. I'm going to come to that later, and part of it immediately. The worst kind of moderate nationalism would be, of course, to become a civic nationalist party like UKIP, that pretends that all the peoples of the world are interchangeable, and that immigration, when it's seen as a problem at all, remember Mr. Farage's words in 2013 about wanting immigration, but if it's a problem at all, is simply a problem of numbers. We need to acknowledge that immigration is primarily a problem of ethnicity, and of alien ethnicity at that. However, we must avoid terms for ethnic groups that are pejorative or offensive, and to a large extent I think that does happen. But we must also avoid blanket condemnations of any ethnic group, even when an ethnic group is disproportionately responsible for some activity or other. What we mustn't imply is that the responsibility is shared by all or most when it's not. A habit that many nationalists have when listened to by a favourable nationalist audience is to say outrageous things because they produce the loudest cheers. But frankly, some of those outrageous things would absolutely appall Mr. and Mrs. Average if those words were heard. And Mr. and Mrs. Average's votes are votes that we clearly need. I remember back in, I think it was about 2007, 2008, there was an opinion poll that said that, horror, shock, gasp, something like between a fifth and a quarter of voters said they would consider voting for the BNP. Now, that proportion nationally never did, but between 20% and 25% said that. But in addition to those, there was another swathe of people, I think it was about 15% or 20%, who, whilst they said they would never consider voting for us, certainly did say that they could understand the points that we were making. They could understand our concerns. Now, if a nationalist party in the future were ever to hope to come to power, it would have to get not only the 20-25%, but that 15 and 20% as well. The people who at the moment wouldn't dream of voting for a nationalist party, even though they understand our concerns. But what happens sometimes is that at nationalist meetings, fortunately ones that nobody really notices, all kinds of blood-curdling things are said. The chairman of the party with which many of us were associated, in a Twitter, commented on how he would like to see David Cameron hanged for treason. When I reminded him of that, and it was repeated at a meeting of members, there were some people who cheered it along. And he said, look, see, they like it. I said, yes, but the people out there, Mr. and Mrs. Average, would not only dislike it, they would find it utterly horrific. that somebody claiming to be the leader of a serious party would be making suggestions of doing away with their political opponents. And if one named political opponent, why not all of them? Because that would logically follow, and it would be a horrific logic that most people would be utterly appalled by. I heard a comment recently, I'm not going to be more specific, at a nationalist meeting, in which somebody referred to the people who've been convicted and sentenced for grooming and said, yes, we'll make sure all of these are hanged by the neck. And I'm sure that satisfied a sort of inward feeling in the speaker and perhaps in some of the audience. But, there is a big but, you cannot change the law, you can't change sentences retrospectively or retroactively. The sort of country that does that is a tyranny. And we fight very hard to make sure that people don't see us as potential tyrants. And we must avoid saying things of that kind. However tempting or however satisfying sometimes saying things like that might be. Now, as I said, we mustn't become the wrong kind of moderate. These civic nationalists. A saying that I used to use regularly in the European Parliament and its committees, and it's been repeated since then, is distinctive peoples are not the product of distinctive cultures. Distinctive cultures are ultimately the product of distinctive peoples. Now, these words are not just for our ears. They've got to be proclaimed from the rooftops to the British people in general, as a whole, and policymakers in particular. There must be a war of ideas in which the truth replaces falsity. Because for decades, and it is decades, public policy, developed in government departments, debated in Parliament, and discussed in the media, have been based on a provably false premise. The false premise is a nurturist premise. The assertion that individuals and indeed whole peoples are simply the product of their experience, their culture, without any significant contribution from heredity. The truth is, on balance, the opposite. Differences in ability and in behaviour between individuals and between different peoples are attributable to hereditary differences much more than they are to differences in experience or culture. Now, this is relevant to immigration policy more than to any other, because if you change the people of a country, then you change the country. You change the nation from one nation to another quite different nation. Allowing Afro-Asian immigrants to compensate for a falling birth rate, which is in fact what's been happening, a falling birth rate among the indigenous population will not produce new Britons among the indigenous population to make up for the shortfall in the birth rate. It will turn our nation into an Afro-Asian nation, or partly an Afro-Asian nation. But of course, there are other areas of policy where this nurturist fallacy has had its effect. One is in the area of crime and punishment policy. Whenever a particularly brutal crime is committed, the question that's routinely asked is, what could have made the perpetrator do that? What could have made the perpetrator become a person who could do something like that? What they're really meaning, what they're implying, is what is it in the perpetrator's upbringing or in their experience that could have changed him or her from a nice or potentially nice altruistic person into a brutal one. Sometimes the expert being interviewed, and I'll let you into a secret, the expert is nearly always a sociologist, the expert being interviewed will add the following assertion: people are not born murderers, you know. The interviewer, of course, knows nothing of the sort, but's been conditioned against questioning the truth of that assertion. and of course that would never do. The nature-nurture continuum, to the extent that it still exists, is also relevant to education. One thing that's been noticed with a certain amount of alarm in educational circles is the proportion of educationally successful people coming from families in unskilled occupations has been steadily falling. And this is represented by those so-called educationists as a demonstration that equality of opportunity has declined too. Of course, it proves nothing of the kind. If we regard the 1944 Education Act, that came into force in 1947, as the sort of benchmark, or at least the point at which equality of opportunity started, secondary education for all, then we've had something like 4 or 5 generations. And once you have 4 or 5 generations of equality of opportunity, that will inevitably lead to a new consolidation and not a speed up in mobility, but a slowdown. And that isn't any interference with equality of opportunity. Now, this war of ideas must be fought in parallel with the political battle. Furthermore, I believe that it can be fought across party lines. There might well be and continue to be differences between different organisations when, if you like, addressing their own agendas, but I think the war of ideas can be fought across party lines, possibly with the same material. Now, we've certainly not managed to create or even adopt a party that's likely to become overnight a successful electable party. However, we have produced what I would see as the template of such a party, as the pattern of such a party, which none of the other fragments has managed to do. Because whatever party emerges, whether it's one of the existing ones or whether a new party comes along, whatever party emerges from the current muddle and fragmentation, it would have to take on board our unique selling points. First of all, the right kind of moderation without adopting the wrong kind of moderation. A constitution that's thoroughly democratic. Most important of all, safeguards against the misuse of disciplinary procedures or misuse of security personnel to be used for factional purposes, something that we've seen for many a day, many a year in all manner of nationalist parties. And finally, and perhaps most importantly of all, a new internal political culture that breeds tolerance of colleagues, that ceases to regard people who have different ideas within your party as the enemy, but see them as people with whom we can compromise and we can discuss. Only when those principles have been accepted can an electable party emerge. But that would only be a necessary condition for that electable party, not a sufficient one. Thank you.
If you'd like to know more about the Brit Downs, go to www.britishdemocraticparty.org and click on the contact option. To join, you can click on the application form, or you can apply directly to British Democratic Party, PO Box 10376, Loughborough, LE11 9HT, or telephone 07513 975 408.